try to get people hot under the collar, right?
You guys are cool.
Can you believe he started by saying he felt the need to warm up the audience? All right, we have some other business to take care of. I'd like to introduce some people who will comprise our panel tonight. And we'll spend a couple of minutes from each of their perspectives talking about what this evening and some of the things that have been, some of the issues that have been raised tonight mean to them from their own particular perspective. I'll ask them each to come up as I introduce them. Hold your applause, please, until they're all on the stage. And we'll begin with Denise Lieberman, the Senior Attorney for the Advancement Project, an organization that promotes racial and social justice. She's coordinator of the Voter Protection Coalition. I'm sorry, it's the Voter Protection Coalition. Chris Gunter is president of the Missouri National Education Association. She is a teacher on leave from the Francis Howell District. Byron Clemens is regional vice president of the American Federation of Teachers, AFL-CIO. John Hickey, executive director of the environmental organization Sierra Club, Missouri chapter. And David Cook is president of Local 655 of the United Food and Commercial Workers. Each of these folks on stage is going to take a couple of moments, as I suggested, to kind of respond to what some of the things that Bob has to say today from their perspective. When they're finished, we'll do a little housekeeping. It won't take very long. Then we'll come back and take your questions. So, Denise, let's begin with you.
Thank you so much, Tom. And thank you, Bob, for bringing this very important issue to light. I'm so pleased to see so many people here, as I'm sure all my colleagues on the panel, because this is about our voices and about our ability to be able to continue to have a voice. Bob Becker in his talk said that thanks to ALEC and campaign finance laws, you're going to get the best elected officials that money can buy. And we don't need to look very far this week in Wisconsin to see the reality of that playing out, right? I just got back from Wisconsin where I witnessed incredible passion and perseverance of voters who showed up at the polls in huge numbers, 80, 85% voter turnout that day. And yet, Governor Scott Walker was able to retain his seat thanks in large part to the fact that he was able to outspend his opponent 7.5 times to 1. Funded in large part by corporate interests, the very same interests that are seeking to undermine many of the issues that you came here to express concern about tonight. But you know, if money isn't enough, those bankrolling these politicians, and by the way, the American Legislative Exchange Council is a significant funder of Governor Scott Walker, they also want to make sure that you're not going to be able to exercise your vote at the polls. And we are seeing right now, today in America, an unprecedented attack on the right to vote, the likes of which we haven't seen for over a century. We haven't seen this level of legislative activity seeking to make it harder to register to vote, to cast a ballot, and to have that ballot counted since the post-Reconstruction era. And these measures are not accidental. 40 states since 2010 have introduced legislation designed to make it harder to access the ballot. 35 states introduced bills that would require voters to show restrictive forms of identification in order to cast a ballot at the polls. 35 states. That is not a coincidence, and it's not an accident. These bills were introduced based on model legislation designed by the American Legislative Exchange Council, bankrolled in large part by major corporations as well as the Koch brothers. who sit on ALEC's corporate board, which, by the way, retains veto power over the legislation that they decide to promote as model legislation. ALEC drafts model legislation that its supporters want to see passed in the states and farms it out to the states, to its legislative members. And because of this, my friends, we saw voter ID bills flood states around the country in the last year. Last year alone, 8 states passed voter ID bills. Actually, 13 states passed voter ID bills. Fortunately, we had governors in 5 states who were strong enough to veto those bills. And this year, several more states have joined the pack. These bills restrict the forms of identification allowed at the polls only to non-expired state-issued photo ID, something that may seem reasonable on its face, but when in fact you look at the issues behind it, it's actually, it's a poll tax, frankly. It's a poll tax designed to suppress the vote of people who would have difficulty or for whom it would be impossible to get the forms of ID necessary. Because in order to get a state-issued photo ID, you have to present numerous underlying forms of identification, such as a certified birth certificate that many people are not able to get. And why? It's not because there's a big problem with voter fraud that these laws are intended to address. Study after study shows that in fact it simply doesn't exist. In-person voter impersonation is not a problem at the polls. So why? Because the people that bankroll ALEC don't want the folks who are most likely to be affected by voter ID laws to be able to cast a ballot. Who is that? About 21 million voting eligible U.S. citizens. Disproportionately African Americans, young voters, low-income earners, people with disabilities, and senior citizens. We are not alone. Right here in Missouri, we are also seeing this assault on our right to vote. Missouri has introduced legislation that would impose these restrictions every year since 2006, when our own Supreme Court concluded that these laws would infringe on the fundamental right to vote, that it constituted a poll tax. And yet, we continue to see, each year since then, legislators introduce voter ID in Missouri. Who are these folks? Take out your sheet that you received from today. The sponsors of photo ID legislation in Missouri are all members of the American Legislative Exchange Council. Representative John Deal, he himself a former elections official, shameful. Representative Stanley Cox. And this year, the voter ID bill is championed by a newcomer to this debate, Representative Shane Scholler, who is seeking to become your next state's chief elections officer himself. And all these bills were heard by whom? Oh, the elections committee, chaired by, oh, there he is, Representative Tony Trump. It is no accident, it is no coincidence, there is no legitimate legislative purpose behind these laws. They are part of a nationwide coordinated effort. We can fight back though, and we have. In states around the country, the Justice Department is stepping in and striking down these laws. I myself am counsel in lawsuits that have been filed challenging photo ID laws in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania. We have lawsuits in Texas and in several other places as well. And right here in Missouri, after the legislature passed a proposed amendment to our Constitution to strip out the right to vote that our Supreme Court said was violated by photo ID laws, we filed a lawsuit saying that that ballot initiative was deceptive and misleading to Missouri voters. And this March, a judge said that's right and took that measure off the ballot. So while these efforts will continue to push their way through and may seem insurmountable to overcome, I want to echo Dr. Ecker's Director's comments, that together we can fight and we can step up if we continue to raise our voices. Thank you.